Today, we're getting into something really fascinating, often debated too, the Anunnaki theory.
Yeah, and it's based on this great collection of sources you, our listener, provided. We've got stuff from the Y-Files, Sci-Fi Central, Astroway, Universe Inside You, and The Fifth Kind.
A real mix of perspectives, definitely, all touching on this, this idea of ancient astronauts, basically, and how they might have influenced humanity.
It's quite a range. Interpretations of ancient texts, archaeology, even potential links to modern science. It's perfect for you if you want to get a solid overview fast.
Absolutely. So our mission here, pulling this all together, is to, well, extract the core ideas about the Anunnaki from these sources.
Right. Where did they supposedly come from? What were they doing on Earth?
Exactly. And what's the evidence cited? We're sticking to what's in these materials, keeping it neutral on any bigger agendas.
Okay, let's dive in. So, origins. Where did the story say they came from?
Right, origins. The sources, especially those looking at Sumerian tablets, they point to a planet called Nibiru.
Nibiru. Yeah, that name comes up a lot. Supposedly way out in our solar system, right?
Right.
With this huge 3,600-year orbit.
A 3,600-year orbit. That's just wild to even think about. And Nibiru itself, the descriptions mention it being large, lots of iron oxide, made the water look red.
That's the picture painted. And the reason they supposedly came here, big problems back home, and an environmental crisis, basically. Their atmosphere was failing.
Okay. A dying world. So they needed something Earth had, and that something was gold.
Gold, yeah. Several sources really hit this point. The idea was if you grind gold down superfine nanoparticles and put it in the atmosphere, it could act like a shield, reflect radiation, maybe stabilize things.
And the Y-Files mentioned NASA using gold foil, like a modern parallel.
Exactly. It adds this layer of, well, maybe it's not completely out there. Shows that they supposedly had some advanced material science knowledge, at least according to these interpretations.
Interesting. So to get this gold, they traveled here, like 450,000 years ago? That's the time frame mentioned.
Around then, yeah. Long before us, obviously. Earth had early hominids then, like Homo erectus. Astroway mentions that context.
And they set up a base, focused just on mining gold.
Pretty much. A place called Eridug, down in the Persian Gulf area, led by a figure named Enki, sometimes called Earth Station 1.
Enki, right. He comes up a lot. And this ties into that Sumerian king's list idea. Kingship descending from heaven.
That's how proponents rate it, yeah, literal descent. They arrived, they ruled. And the Y-Files notes, they weren't alone initially. They brought another group, the Ijigi.
And they were doing the hard labor.
Initially, yes. Kind of like a slave race, doing the digging in the mines. But apparently it was brutal work.
Brutal enough for a revolt. I saw references to the Atrahasis poem.
Exactly. Both Astroway and Y-Files mention it. The Ijigi rebelled. The conditions were too much. The burden was far too heavy, as one source quoted the poem.
Okay, so a labor shortage. The EGG won't work. What's the Anunnaki solution then? This is where humans come in, right?
This is the big one. To solve the labor problem, the story goes, Enki, who's often described as this master geneticist, basically created humans.
Created us? How?
By mixing their own Anunnaki DNA with the DNA of the hominids already here on Earth, like Homo erectus. Universe Inside You goes into that genetic engineering angle.
Wow. Direct genetic modification. And these first humans were called Adamu, like Adam.
Adamu, yeah. The connection to the Hebrew Adam for man is often pointed out. Clear parallel.
And our purpose then was just work, be the new miners.
Primarily, yes. To take over from the Igigi, do the mining, other tasks. Universe Inside You made that point about the word avad, meaning worship now, but originally meaning work for. Shows the relationship, supposedly.
A workforce. And these Anunnaki, they were physically different. Giant compared to early humans.
Oh, yeah, huge. Figures like 10 to 16 feet tall are mentioned in the Y-Files. Early humans were much smaller, under 6 feet.
And the depictions. Elongated skulls, big eyes. Astroway mentioned those features showing up in ancient art.
That's often cited as visual evidence, yes. But the sources also suggest it wasn't just about labor. They apparently taught humans things, too.
Like what? Basic instructions for mining?
More than that, it seems. Social skills, academics, technology. Universe Inside You mentioned this educational aspect. Though you have to wonder why they'd educate a slave race beyond basics, right? Maybe efficiency. Or something else.
Good question. The sources don't really elaborate on the why there.
Not explicitly in the ones we reviewed. It's kind of presented as just something they did.
Okay. And initially, these first humans, the Adamu, they couldn't reproduce.
Apparently not. Sterile. But then, needing more workers, The Anunnaki supposedly tweaked the design again, enabled reproduction.
And that led to overpopulation. Is that the banished from Eden link some sources make?
That's the connection universe inside you draws, yeah. Too many humans may be getting out of hand, leading to this separation or banishment narrative.
And then there were unauthorized relations, Anunnaki and humans.
Right. Forbidden unions, mentioned in the Y-Files and Astroway. The offspring were called the Nephilim, the giants of old, from biblical texts. This apparently really angered Enlil, another key Anunnaki leader.
Enlil wasn't happy, and unions with the Igigi produced monsters.
That's part of the narrative too, yes. It paints a picture of, well, genetic chaos almost.
Definitely dramatic. Which leads us to another huge event, the Great Flood.
Absolutely pivotal in these accounts. And the sources stress how similar the stories are across cultures. Sumerian texts like Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, and the Bible's Noah story.
But the Sumerian versions are older, right? Much older.
By millennia, yeah. The Y-Files really underscores that point. The flood story existed long before the Hebrew Bible.
And what caused the flood, according to these theories, the Y-Files linked it to Nibiru again.
Yes, a close pass-by of Nibiru, triggering massive earth changes, ice sheets crashing, huge tsunamis, a global cataclysm.
Terrifying. But someone was warned. Enki again.
Enki, yeah. He seems to be the more sympathetic figure towards humans in these tales. He supposedly warned one man, Zusudra, in Sumerian Noah, or Unapishtim in others, to build a boat.
Build an ark, save his family, save the animals. The basic story we know.
Exactly. Preserve the seeds of life, the genetic blueprints, essentially.
And the flood was devastating, wiped most life out.
That's the account. Total devastation. Universe inside you. Mentioned looking at ice core data showing rapid sea level rise back then, which some connect to this flood event.
So after the flood, what happened? Did the Anunnaki just leave?
Not immediately. The sources say they actually helped humanity rebuild, established new cities, taught more skills.
Were teaching? What kind of things this time?
Reading, writing, math, astronomy, engineering. The foundations of civilization, basically.
Yeah.
Universe inside you even suggests things like the pyramids, other big ancient monuments maybe aligned to stars, were built with their help or tech.
Anunnaki tech behind the pyramids. That's a big claim.
It's definitely out there in these sources, yeah. A way to explain how such structures were supposedly built back then.
So, arrival, creation, flood, rebuilding. But they did eventually leave. Why?
The narrative suggests they did. Maybe Nibiru's atmosphere finally got fixed, so the gold wasn't the main priority anymore. That's one idea. Astroway also hints at maybe internal conflicts among the Anunnaki themselves, or shifts in power could have played a role.
Okay, but they didn't just vanish. They set up systems before leaving, like human kings.
Right. They established human rulers, monarchs, to act as their stand-ins, their intermediaries on Earth.
And maybe even tweaked royal bloodlines. Universe inside you mentioned that possibility.
That idea is floated, yeah. Keeping a connection, a lineage. And Sumerian civilization itself, its sudden rise is often presented as Exhibit A.
Like it just appeared, fully formed, gifted by the Anunnaki.
That's the argument Universe Inside You makes. A sudden advanced culture. And the Anunnaki stories, their teachings, they morphed over time, right?
Into myths and legends across the world. Sumerian, Egyptian, Indian.
Exactly. Sci-Fi Central covers that transformation. How the core story might echo in different cultural myths. They even noted the sound similarity Anunnaki, Anakim, in Hebrew, and the idea of shining ones.
Right, the shining ones. And Elohim in the Bible.
Yeah, Sci-Fi Central and The Fifth Kind both discuss that. Elohim is plural in Hebrew. So the argument is maybe it originally meant the powerful ones, referring to the Anunnaki group, not a single god.
A reinterpretation of religious texts through this Anunnaki lens.
That's a big part of it. Plus, things like the crazy long lifespans of early Sumerian kings listed in the Kings List, The Fifth Kind, and Astroway point to that as maybe hinting at non-human rulers.
Okay, so that's the narrative, the story pulled from the text. But what about, harder evidence? What do these sources point to?
Well, Zecharia Sitchin's work is central, obviously, his translations of the Sumerian tablets. Although the Y-Files did mention the criticisms, like the debate over what Anunnaki actually means.
Yes.
Royal blood or those from heaven to earth came.
Right, the translation is key. Anything else? Genetics.
The Y-Files brought up that TKTL1 gene mutation, happening around the time humans made that big leap forward cognitively. It raises the possibility of genetic tinkering, but doesn't prove Anunnaki did it. Still begs the question of what did cause that leap, though.
True. What about archaeology? Weird statues? Big structures.
Astroway lists a few common examples, while noting mainstream science isn't convinced. Megalithic sites like Baalbek or Pumapunku with impossible stonework, artwork showing weird figures, big heads, big eyes, the Nazca lines, those Ubaid figurines from
I think
Mesopotamia.
Slittered-like ones, yeah, those are strange.
Definitely strange. And then there's the Planet Nine stuff. Could it be Nibiru? The Y-Files touches on that speculation, linking it to NASA's search for a big hidden planet.
A potential modern connection. And ancient tech. Flying machines.
Astroway mentions texts like the Indian Vimanas, describing flying craft, and powerful weapons. Could these be garbled accounts of Anunnaki tech? It's posed as a question.
And the me. Those divine laws or blueprints.
Yeah, the Sumerian me, sometimes interpreted as maybe representing advanced tech or knowledge databases the Anunnaki controlled.
So, lots of threads pointing towards something unusual happening back then, even if the Anunnaki part is interpretation. The Great Leap Forward remains a mystery.
It does. And the fifth kind really pushes the idea that many Bible stories are essentially Sumerian stories retold, recasting the Anunnaki, powerful ones, as God or angels later on.
But they also admit there's no crashed spaceship, no definitive Anunnaki artifact found, right?
Right. The fifth kind acknowledges that lack of smoking gun physical proof. They use that analogy like modern colonizers, maybe direct control feeded into subtler influence over time.
Interesting analogy. And they also suggested the Anunnaki weren't necessarily all bad or all good, a mixed bag.
Yeah, the fifth kind presented that nuance. Enki helping humans survive the flood, maybe even upgrading consciousness alongside the whole workforce control narrative. It wasn't painted as purely one thing.
Okay, that's a lot to digest. A really wide-ranging look based on these sources. So maybe let's try to summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive into the Anunnaki theory.
Sure. We've covered their supposed origins on Nibiru, coming here for gold due to an atmospheric crisis, then the creation of humans, the Adamu, as a workforce via genetic engineering, possibly involving Enki.
Right. Then the Igigi revolt that preceded it, the Great Flood linked perhaps to Nibiru's orbit with Enki warning a Noah-like figure.
And their role in rebuilding civilization afterward, teaching humanity various skills before eventually departing, leaving behind human kings, maybe altered bloodlines.
And their legacy living on in myths, legends, possibly religious texts like the Elohim concept, and maybe even influencing our biology or sudden leaps in development.
That's the core narrative presented across these sources, yeah? And we saw that kinds of evidence cited Sitchin's translations, archaeological anomalies, genetic questions, ancient texts describing advanced tech.
And we got to reiterate, this is all drawn from the specific sources you provided. Lots of different scientific and historical viewpoints exist outside of these particular interpretations.
Absolutely. Which leads to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. You see these recurring themes everywhere, right? Creation stories, global floods, powerful beings intervening in myths from totally different parts of the world.
Yeah, it is striking how common those elements are.
So forgetting the specific Anunnaki details for a second, what might these persistent ancient stories tell us about humanity's own deep questions? About where we came from, our purpose, our place in the universe?
Like these myths are tapping into some fundamental human curiosity or maybe even memory.
Perhaps. And what about those hints in some sources about, like, switches inside us, dormant abilities or potentials? Whether put there by Anunnaki or not, what might still be waiting to be, well, discovered or flipped within ourselves?
Some really big questions to ponder there. Definitely food for thought. Thank you again for sending over such a rich and mind-bending set of materials for us to explore.
It was fascinating stuff.
Until our next deep dive, keep asking those questions.